Hi everyone. This session is about ecological economics, which is a transdisciplinary field. So ecological economics is not trying to be a subdiscipline of economics or a subdiscipline of ecology, but really it's a bridge across not only ecology and economics, but also fields like psychology, anthropology, archaeology, and history. That's what ecological economics argues is necessary to get a more integrated, holistic picture of how people have interacted with their environment in the past and how they might interact in the future. So it's an attempt to look at humans embedded in their ecological life support system, not separate from the environment. It also has some design elements, like in the sense of how do we design a sustainable future. And it's not just analysis of the past, but it applies that analysis to create something new and ultimately better. So ecological economics is explicitly concerned with sustainability, whereas environmental economics is concerned with efficient resource allocation related to environmental goods and services, for example, correcting a limited set of market failures. There is a degree of overlap, but the sustainability concern is much broader. Um, Environmental economics is a subdiscipline of economics, so it's applying standard economic thinking to the environment. And for the most part, mainstream economics is focused largely on markets. And while it recognizes that they are externalities, they are external, they're out there. While ecological economics tries to study everything outside the market as well as everything inside the market and bring the two together. Conventional economics doesn't really recognize the importance of scale, the fact that we live on a finite planet, or that the economy as a subsystem cannot grow indefinitely into this larger containing system. There are some biophysical limits there. The mainstream view doesn't recognize those limits or thinks that technology can solve any resource constraint problems. And it's not that we can't continue to improve the human situation, but we have to recognize that the environment creates certain limits and constraints, and we have to define a safe operating space within which allows us to do the best that we can, is what the argument ecological economics makes. So, a starting definition from Costanza, who I'm relying on heavily for this lesson, is ecological economics is a transdisciplinary approach that looks at a full range of interrelationships between ecological and economic systems. And the three interrelated goals of ecological economics are sustainable scale, which we just talked about in the previous slide, and also fair distribution and efficient allocation. And all three of these contribute to human well-being and sustainability. So the goal of ecological economics is to then develop deeper scientific understanding of the complex linkages between human and natural systems, and to use this understanding to develop effective policies that will then lead to a world that is ecologically sustainable. There's a fair distribution of resources and efficiently allocates those scarce resources, including natural and social capital. And distribution has many different impacts, not the least of which its impact on social capital and on quality of life. For example, if the distribution of income is too big, that creates competing groups within a society and you lose cooperation. And there's actually a lot of research to show that more unequal societies are less productive in the end because they spend a lot of their energy trying to maintain that income gap. So distribution has a lot of direct and indirect feedbacks on how the society is actually functioning that the conventional view tends to ignore. It just focuses on having more. The idea being that the more we have, the more we can spread around. But in actuality, a lot of the research indicates that that's not very helpful for society, and it's also we're running into biophysical constraints and entering a time where we have to maybe start worrying about distribution because we may not always have more to spread around. Another key point is allocation is important within mainstream economics. But to think that the market is efficient at allocating resources requires a very long list of assumptions that are less and less realistic, uh, including one that there have to be no externalities. And what is actually being shown repeatedly is that natural and social externalities are actually larger even than the internalities of what's going on in the market. So in that situation, you can't expect the market to efficiently allocate resources using a neoclassical mainstream model. So the goal of this lesson is to give a brief introduction to ecological economics and apply what you have learned to a practical lesson. But first, in ecological economics prioritizes sustainable scale of an action, and then it determines the justness, fairness, and ethicality of the distribution of resources. And then finally, it thinks about efficiency. So ecological economics has a different philosophy of science than environmental economics. At a very high level, environmental economics tries to adhere to logical empiricism, the view that scientific knowledge is the only kind of factual knowledge, and knowledge is derived from the scientific method. Whereas ecological economics adheres to post-normal science. It describes fields in which high-cost decisions must be made, but there is a good deal of uncertainty with relation to the relevant scientific facts. So think climate change, biodiversity, these big problems that are wicked in nature and that they have very complex uncertainties. Post-normal science wants a democratization of scientific knowledge through an extended peer community to integrate local knowledge, values, and interest. So this has implications for what the boundaries are in terms of what is considered to be knowledge, how that knowledge is created and collected, and what methods can be used. And so ecological economics is problem focused. So we'll work through an illustrative example. And this has been done in the past face-to-face in groups, but because of the nature of our situation, I'm not sure how easily we are able to collaborate. So this can be a standalone model. Of course, it's always helpful to discuss and collaborate with others. So do that if that helps you. But I'd like to continue talking about ecological economics, and it has a different worldview. The EE worldview is that the economy is a subsystem embedded within and fundamentally dependent on a larger but ultimately bounded and finite environmental system. So the economy is within the environmental system. This is kind of opposite of the environmental economics in which the economy is bigger and we just kind of draw from the environment as we need to. Ecological economics argues that economic decisions should take awareness of complex systems theory, the possibility for irreversible changes or tipping points, true uncertainty, and being aware of how large the impact of the economic subsystem is relative to the boundaries of the system as a whole. Environmental economics focuses on the market economy as the system of interest. And as I said, it takes stuff from and deposits stuff to the environment, but it doesn't consider any of those other issues. Ecological economics also recognizes lots of non-monetary values and decision making using those values, whereas environmental economics requires a monetary unit and ignores things that cannot be dealt with in that unit. So ecological economics also finally cares explicitly about ethicality. See the previous slide on scale, distribution, and allocation. Whereas environmental economics just claims neutrality on that point. It means it doesn't do anything to redress existing ethical issues. So what is a EE problem? It's multi-dimensional sustainability problem where the focus is on the interlinkages between the dimensions of the problem. Human decisions regarding resource allocation are a part of what is driving the problem, and human decision making is required to solve the problem. So when looking at an ecological economics problem, you have to identify the cause of the problem, identify the solution to the problem, and develop awareness of interlinkages between dimensions of the problem. So we'll use an interrupted case study to show you how these data points all need to be interlinked and connected to form a solution using the ecological economics model of fairness and distribution and scale. So let's say this is the target problem. Over the past couple of decades, America has been losing forests and open space at an estimated average of 6,000 acres a day, or 4 acres a minute. And over the next 20 years, 57 million acres of forest in the U.S. is at a high threat of development. And again, in class, you'd make a note, and then we talk about it and use groups. So the environmental dimension of the problem. We'll look at forests provide a range of services including fish and wildlife habitat, carbon storage, and water management. Forests can raise and lower the water table, can stabilize topsoil and decrease erosion, can support significant biodiversity. They can remove atmospheric pollutants, and they also sequester about 15% of the total US carbon emissions annually. The social dimension of the problem is between 1950 and 2000, the percentage of the US population living in rural areas has declined, and the population in many rural areas is rapidly aging, and healthcare coverage is poor in rural areas. A third of rural landowners and their offspring are underinsured in terms of healthcare. The vast majority, about 65 to 90% of rural landowners and their offspring lack health insurance coverage for long-term care. And there are issues of outmigration, so people leaving these areas, especially associated with young people pursuing higher education. So it's a good idea to think about any solutions for the deforestation problem that take this social dimension into account and to brainstorm on some of those. Okay, now we'll look at the economic dimension of the problem. So rural areas have lower wages and higher levels of chronic poverty than urban areas in the US. 42% of jobs in the rural US are low skill, and support mechanisms like job training, childcare, public transportation are all less common in rural uh, US. And the cost of living in rural areas in the US is not necessarily lower than in urban areas. So you'd make a note of all these economic problems and try to think about um, how you could plan for solutions that take the economic dimension into account. And then once you've considered the economic, the social, and the environmental aspects, you try to put that all together. And then you would also take into account key additional information that just over 50% of forests in the US are privately owned. And of this 50%, 62% is owned by individuals and families. 45% is owned by people over the age of 65. And then you would also see that for many woodland owners, their forests are their largest and most valuable asset. And then taking into account, again, the environmental, the social, and the economic dimensions and other relevant strands of data and information, you would think about how does this change the overall picture and try to get to a best guess as to the heart of the problem. And then think about your best attempt at a solution to the problem given all of this information synthesized together. And this kind of problem solving is not just in a thought experiment, but was actually implemented in Oregon by the Forest Health Human Health Initiative, which is a non-government organization. They found this connection between deforestation and healthcare, and they did extensive interviews across 5 states and confirmed um, that 1/3 of landowners anticipated needing to accelerate the sale of timber to pay for healthcare. Remember, timber was their most valuable asset, and they didn't have any other means to pay for these healthcare costs. So they were selling it, and then it was being deforested. And the healthcare costs, as I just mentioned, were the most likely trigger for the sale of private forest lands to these large timber companies. So the trial solution then was to combine the following. The environmental and social interest in the voluntary carbon markets. They had interest from healthcare providing companies in reducing their net carbon footprint, and the high demand for healthcare in rural areas where forest owners live. They put all that together, and this became the form of carbon credits and a tax-free A-tree M card. And they would use these 90% of the post-transaction cost value of the carbon credits was allocated for families to use on healthcare costs only, and 10% goes into the community fund, which was also healthcare focused. And you can see a very interesting video of this by clicking on the link below. So the key points of this Forest Health Human Health Initiative was to look at this. Looking at a single dimension in isolation does not provide the complete picture either of the causes or of the possible solutions. And you need to take into account the different dimensions, the social, the environmental, and the economic interactions, and how those all influence each other. And the consideration of these interactions is really important for addressing the problem. Okay, so these are all ecological economic areas of interest. Origins of money, alternative currencies, renewable energy, degrowth, circular economy, sustainable cities, diseases from animals or uh, insects, the financial system, automation of machinery, the manufacturing sector, agriculture, food security, marine fisheries, aging populations. There's just a wealth of topics. And for this week, we're going to find 3 journal articles related to a position that you would like to claim, that you would like to defend, that you would like to persuasively argue. And we're going to use policy instruments that we've covered in the past weeks and embed them into our claims or our thesis statements. And for example, let's say your initial position statement for the essay is policy instruments like taxes and subsidies are woefully inadequate for stopping the spread of diseases transmitted by insects. You would then find 3 journal articles and provide an overview of each article, the limitations of each, and highlight the relevance of each to your own study. And I'll try to provide an example of what I'm talking about on the discussion board, and hope you have a good week.